there's kind of two parts to my presentation that will come up shortly. The first kind of covers the current departmental approach to quantifying the impacts of resilience. And I think we'll also cover kind of some of the limitations of that kind of current approach as well, based on some of the conversations that we've already had today. And then the second part of the presentation is a bit of a case study about how we've tried to assess the kind of impacts of disruption within an area of UK transport. So yeah, that's what I'm going to cover. The first kind of comes a bit back to what was just being mentioned about how we define resilience. And I think we've spoken about this quite a lot already today, so I'm not going to go into this in too much detail. But I think when coming back to the objectives of this session, which is around assessing and quantifying the impacts and costs of disruption, it's really those ensuring that we're thinking about it holistically from a social and economic, cultural and environmental perspective, and not just focusing in on that kind of efficiency, cost saving element that historically maybe we have done with the kind of capitalism market that currently exists. And then the other thing on this slide that I just want to always pull out, that I'm not sure we've spoken too much about already today, is just how different types of shocks and kind of coming back to the equilibrium varies a lot between different types of shocks and different types of transport. And I think it was kind of one of the things that was mentioned earlier around the different modes of transport, how they can be perceived in terms of having different levels of risk, and different acceptable levels of risk does vary a lot. So it's really important in terms of thinking about that holistically, as well as at kind of a modal basis. So on the next slide, I cover really kind of how the Department for Transport currently would tackle approaching transport resilience. And this is probably quite familiar to many of you who are aware with transport appraisal. And those areas are the kind of direct costs to government and transport authorities, those costs to transport users, and then also the costs to the wider supply chain and a wider economic disequilibria impacts. I won't go into this in too much detail, as I think kind of people are familiar with this. But I think based on, again, thinking back about some of the conversations we've had already, we focused a lot, and kind of transport systems have focused a lot on those kind of costs to government and those costs to transport authorities, as that's probably the easiest thing for governments and authorities to control, and also for kind of the private sector to control, because they are, particularly in a privatized transport sector like the UK, where a lot of it is privatized, they have objectives around kind of profit maximization for their shareholders, etc. But then kind of going on to the cost of transport users, this is very much the kind of typical value of time information type analysis, where we would look at kind of commuting, businesses, leisure, as well as some of those maybe second order effects on spillovers, multipliers, as well as things like reliability, which I think when we look at resilience and disruption, reliability of that transport network is really important. The next bit around the supply chain is probably an area where we've historically done a lot less work in this space, and is probably something which has never really been considered kind of holistically. But we need to kind of think about kind of that holistic supply chain, which I'll talk about a bit more in detail in the following slide. And then the kind of economic disequilibrium event type analysis is really around those kind of jobs and those business impacts, where we might use things like kind of CGE models, so computable general equilibrium modeling, wider economic impacts, land use interaction that was mentioned earlier as well, of our tools that we use within our kind of armory for assessing these impacts. And then this next slide is really around kind of how the impact of a disruption event will really depend on that overall resilience within the transport system, and will really vary between different causes and magnitudes and across different modes. And I think, thinking back to the previous slide, when we look at individual modal resilience and disruption, we really look at those kind of first two elements. So how much does this cost government? How much does this affect users of transport? But when we're looking at larger systematic failures and resilience issues, like kind of COVID-19, like the climate crisis coming forward, that's where we really need to improve the way we do kind of supply chain type analysis and the equilibria type analysis, as that's not something that we're as trained at or as kind of competent at the moment, and that's definitely an area of improvement. And then the other thing that I wanted to touch on this slide, which I'm not really included on this slide, but I think is really important, is around the distributional impacts of kind of resilience effects and disruption. So the department has quite, and the UK government has quite defined ways that we should look at kind of protected characteristics. So things like income, gender, location, and those sorts of things. And we should always kind of consider that within government policy. How well we do that is another matter, but it's definitely something that we should kind of consider within this space. But also similarly with businesses and freight, we need to kind of consider the impact on small micro businesses and those kind of supply chain type of things. So when kind of thinking about the framework to which we assess things, those distributional factors are going to be really important. And then the next slide is kind of two probably small detailed graphs that might not make too much sense. But the first figure on the left-hand slide is really trying to look at a way that we can look at the kind of supply chain process. And you can see here how multimodal the supply chain is. We can't just focus on the shipping sector. We need to focus on the kind of haulage companies, warehousing, transport companies, the ports, as well as the kind of shipping company themselves, because there's so many different elements to kind of freight and the supply chain that need to be considered, that kind of focusing on things modally and not focusing on things holistically will kind of really limit the kind of ability of government and the sector to kind of come up with the right solution. And then the kind of last graph on this section is really around kind of wider economic impacts. So the way we kind of look at kind of transport appraisal is quite often the easiest thing to do is those direct user benefits. But there are all of these things around dynamic agglomeration, foreign direct investment, trade, induced investment, etc., that we kind of, particularly for these more, as I've already mentioned, these more systematic changes to the transport sector, we need to kind of come up with a way that we can kind of holistically look at this space. But it is a lot more complicated, and that's why generally those kind of quantifications don't happen as much. So then I'm going to cut into a case study on the short straits and some of the work that my team currently doing around trying to look at resilience and disruption at the short straits and what tools we're looking at to kind of assess this. So I was conscious that not everyone will necessarily know what the short straits are. So I won't cover this slide in too much detail, but I will kind of talk a bit about some of the challenges that we face around resilience in this space. So the short straits are the kind of shortest trading route between the UK and continental Europe. So you kind of ignore Northern Ireland and Ireland. That has got a land border. And it offers some real significant advantages over other routes. However, there are some real big challenges that we face in this space, which include kind of infrastructure limitations. So we can't just build bigger and more space there, as the port is very constrained in its current footprint. We have kind of EU border control at Dover and Eurotunnel, and things like EU exit have kind of increased transaction times at the border, which has kind of reduced the resilience that the kind of ports have for disruption. They're both kind of Port of Dover and Eurotunnel are both kind of passenger and freight ports. So there's the interaction of those two modes of transport that if something goes wrong on the freight side, or it's the beginning of the summer holidays, then freight drivers that are driving on the first day of the summer holidays, I feel sorry for them, are going to get stuck in a long queue because everyone's wanting to go to kind of continental Europe for the sun. And also there's really limited kind of HGV parking, so freight parking within Kent, which means when there is disruption, there's very few places where freight vehicles can go in that space. So as a result, there's quite a bit of work that we're doing at the moment looking at the future of traffic management within kind of Kent, kind of going into Dover and Eurotunnel, and what we can do to try and improve the resilience and reduce the disruption in this space. So the next slide is a bit of a kind of graphic of some of the things that we're looking at. So the top bit of this is about I guess, the quantitative work that we're doing, which I'm going to come on to in a couple of slides' time. But here I wanted to touch upon some of the maybe qualitative work or more innovative work that we're doing in this space as well. So one thing that's been mentioned already are digital twins. And this is an area that we're investigating at the moment. It's still very early days, but what we really want to do is try and create a digital twin of the kind of road network within Kent. Try and work with Port of Dover and Eurotunnel about how we could map their operations within their port, which is very difficult as they're commercial enterprises. And I probably should have said on the previous slide that another difficulty of the kind of short straits is that you've got the maritime elements, you've got the international rail elements, you've got the freight elements, you've got government, you've got private enterprises, you've got arm's length bodies. It's kind of really complicated. There's no one kind of organization who can solve this. It has to be a combination of kind of private and public sector to overcome these kind of problems and disruption that we face, as well as on that side of things. And then qualitatively, I think things like logic maps, narratives, kind of case studies of previous disruption. So again, this was mentioned earlier, but something that we try and do is whenever there's been kind of disruption in Kent is try and create a really good case study about what went wrong, what the impacts of that were, and what we might want to change and improve going forward. So there's a few examples of this recently. So during COVID, the French closed the border, and that created quite a lot of queues and disruption in Kent. In 2022, P&O ferries stopped running for a period of time as they replaced their workers with low-cost workers instead, which again kind of really reduced the capacity of the road network. And that was at a time where we were coming out of COVID and out of EU exit, so demand was quite uncertain as well as that period of time. But it's really kind of important to try and gather as much of that evidence as possible at that time. Otherwise, we kind of lose it overall. So yeah, that was kind of what I wanted to cover on that slide. Then this slide, which is probably quite small and hard to read because it's very colourful, is just an example of how kind of complicated developing a logic model could be. And I know earlier we spoke about how this is a real simplification of the approach, and it's actually going to be much more complicated than this. Even though this looks quite complicated, the actual system itself is even more complicated. But it's how do you communicate this to decision makers, to those who can ultimately make the decision to invest or not invest within kind of resolving this disruption. We do have to, as a kind of public sector person who works with ministers, trying to influence ministers to make policy decisions, we will have to make simplifications, and this is an example of that. But I think it's really kind of highlighting what the root causes are, what impacts that have, and therefore the things at the top, what can we actually look at quantifying, which are things like values of time, which are things like the environmental impact, which are things like those costs to businesses and local passengers, local residents within that area who get disrupted by that disruption. So it's just an example of a way of a product that we've presented to ministers to try and let them know kind of what the problem is in this space. And then the last thing that I wanted to cover was around kind of how we tried to do some of the quantification. And again, I've probably simplified this a lot. It is a lot more complicated than this, but again, it's a way of just trying to make it as simple as possible. And we've tried to really develop this framework that could be used for various types of disruption, and breaking it up between those areas that can be quantified and that are qualitative. And then again, this is really using some of those kind of departmental value of time some of the historical evidence of enforcement operation costs, so gathering evidence from the case studies that we've developed previously, feeding this into this model to try and really demonstrate how much the kind of, particularly a recent example is the P&O ferry situation I mentioned earlier, where we've really tried to gather as much evidence as possible around how much that disruption kind of caused costs to the UK economy, and therefore if something like that happened again, or a similar disruption event, what we could do to mitigate that and kind of overcome those costs and benefits. I can't really share, because it's kind of a work in progress, I can't really share any of those numbers with you today, but I kind of wanted to share kind of that high level framework that we've been working on. And then I realized I didn't share the kind of summary slide, but I kind of just wanted to touch upon kind of going back to the questions within the agenda for this roundtable. What do we do kind of well in this space? I think we do try and break those problems down into manageable steps, which is both probably a good and a bad thing. But I think to make kind of particularly public sector decision makers and potentially also kind of business owners really understand the problem, you do have to kind of simplify things and break down the problem. Otherwise it's just too unmanageable in that space. I think we're quite good at mapping out kind of what the problem is and what kind of potential options there are. And I think we're quite good at the kind of traditional transport appraisal, value of time type areas. But where are areas that we still need to improve and we're maybe struggling with on some of this kind of short straits work, it is that kind of whole systems work. An area where the department historically has been very modal. We very much focused on modes individually, but we're starting to kind of have more of a freight network who try and look at the kind of freight sector holistically. And I'd say the other thing that we've really struggled with this piece of work is that kind of forecasting and Amy's left, but kind of forecasting and the baseline situation. So like, how bad is disruption going to be in the short straits going forward? It's really hard to tell because we have kind of historical evidence, but a lot of our historical evidence, we were part of the EU, whereas that no longer is the case. So, and it's also kind of knowing the long-term trends in things like the long-term trends in things like freight flows to the UK and what routes do drivers want to make and stuff. But that's probably the area where I kind of want to focus on more going forward. And the other area where we're looking to develop more is a bit more of a kind of whole systems freight approach, because historically the department has been very focused on users, but I think particularly on the international space, freight is such an important part of kind of international movements on the maritime side that that's an area that we kind of really want to kind of emphasize and improve going forward. So I'm going to stop talking there. The only thing I did want to add is that Laura is also here from the Department of Transport, who kind of leads more on the international kind of climate change resilience side of things. So there's kind of an opportunity to talk a bit about that and our approach on the department side as well. But for the sake of 20 minutes, that's what I wanted to cover.